What's up? I am in the house sick. So, yeah, that's fun. Um, and I said to myself, well, can't just be sitting in here consuming. Let's make some at-home content. So, I was actually, feeling inspired to do this like 2 days ago, 2 to 4 days, weeks ago. But I wanted to talk about like the world thus far, you know. I was literally thinking about that comment on social media. Uh, Bear with me. I'm like I said, I'm sick. But about it was a while ago. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? That 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 meme thingy. Yeah. And I was thinking about it. I was like, it is important to know the contexts that we derive from and are in. Now, I like history a bunch. I enjoy learning about the stories of people. Um, and so I said, why don't I just like dabble into this a little bit? So anyway, yeah, I don't know how to, whatever. So we have the world, right? I live in the U.S. That's all you need to know, really. And it's 2025, right? Um, Man, there's like so many layers to this topic that I want to talk about. So why don't I start going backwards? So I live in the United States. 2025, we got a whole bunch of people in this country, which is cool. Kind of, depending on who you ask. And the United States was literally a compilation of Native Americans, European powers that came into the US between the 1600s and the modern day, and with them bringing the enslaved African populations as well as some free African populations, depending on which year we're talking about. Um, Apparently people don't know all of this stuff. So we are primarily, well, who is we? That's, Lord have mercy. I should have like a whiteboard or something going, but let's just nerd out with it. So originally speaking, there were the Native Americans, over like hundreds of tribes of people. In my old history class, I used to put up a map of the ethno-linguic groups, or the tribal groups, depending on what class it was. It was interesting to see just how full the Western Hemisphere was of people. I think we hear about like some of the First Nations, as a juxtaposition to American history, but I think it's always interesting to understand that history and remembrance is centered around a speaker. Okay, depending on who is telling the story, you're going to get another perspective. Another layer that I think we don't necessarily consider is language. The language of the history is a barrier in of itself. Most of us only in the United States only know an English-based history. So I remember when I was teaching it, I was teaching some Spanish history, or at least Spanish colonial history. And I was like, wow, you guys have a totally different structure of how you got to where you are today. Looking at the gradient between Spaniard, Peninsulares, I think it is, and the blendings with African peoples, native peoples, and then those in between that were born on like the new world soil, as they call it. Um, just like it's a totally different gradient versus um, how the English space is delineated, primarily by race, and even the moving pillar of like moving parameter of what like whiteness was in or is in the United States, how it meant like originally just that British descent, and it expanded into different European descendants. But primarily, like beforehand, I remember there was American. I don't remember. I remember teaching this. I wasn't there. I'm not immortal. But there was American, and then there was like the Irish, French, the Italian. And it's funny, you still hear like white people today, make that delineation. You have some that says I'm American, and others that will say I'm not white, I'm Italian. I'm not white, I'm so like it's such an interesting paradigm and culture in of itself of who is white, who's American, just on that side of things. um, so as the European folks came into U.S. soil, of course, the natives were displaced, oftentimes forcefully. There's a whole rack of injustice around that. I'm not super well read on it as much as I want to be, or I'd like to be. But from what I do remember, there was treaties signed, there was agreements made that, hey, this will be your space, this will be our space. And I recently watched a video about being indigenous. It was literally doing a comparison between Palestine and the Native Americans in terms of cultural erasure. And one of the things that I never realized, because again, it's not my story, but it doesn't mean I can't learn from the stories of others, right? It's important. To be indigenous is to be close to the land itself. If you are a migrant, if you are a transplant, even if you are diasporatic, you are not of the land that you inhabit. So your home or the space you're in can shift, but people who are intimately connected to the lands that they come from, to remove them from the land is to remove them from themselves. And I was like, wow, that is a wildly different take than somebody whose story is being diasporatic, to say, yeah, my land is over there. I've been moved from that land. And going into like African American, Black American, depending on who I'm talking to right now. But the people who went through the American enslavement period, to even not have a geography that feels as though I can lay claim to. I'll say for me personally, it's funny because, you know, I grew up where I grew up, and I'm like, yeah, this section is my home. I feel very close to it. But when the city decides to tear it down or to move it, the layer that is on the place that I inhabit is stripped, and that layer is what I view as like home. So even that is a transitive, or at least geographically speaking, it's a transitive thing. It's interesting. I like how the Black Panthers put it, saying to be African American is to be part of a colony within the United States, because that is truly what it feels like. You live within the dimension of the geography and not in the geography itself. Now, I know in the 70s, 80s, and even before that, there are notions of, we built this country, this is our land. It's so interesting, actually. I remember I wanted to write about it like 5 years ago, about the land claims of America between the three peoples, the natives, the Black Americans or African Americans, and the Euro Americans or the white Americans, and just how there is different starting points of the claimed possession of a physical space, whether ancestry, length of time, being indigenous to it, being the people who worked it and developed it and created the inventions and the progressions that have made this country what it is, or the people who moved in with conquest and took over the spaces and the places. I was reading the Bible actually the other day, well, this passage the other day, and I never saw this before, but the land belongs to God. He said, like, land is his. I said, wow, that's so interesting. I know that is very akin to the native concept of land ownership not being a thing, that the land is a gift to us all. And excuse me if I'm being very general when I'm saying the native perspectives, because I, again, not super well read into the different hundreds of cultures and beliefs and things like that. I'm only going based off of what I've learned as history teacher and as an enjoyer of history. Yeah, so if I'm glazing over things or glossing over things, something's inaccurate, please, a cup full of salt, not a tablespoon, just bear with me, all right? So yes, yeah, America, it's only 300 and something years old. The United States, only, right, 1776 is when they started it. Then they had the Articles of Confederation before that. It's a young country, and I've always said that in groups where we talk about governments and peoples, that America is a child on the world stage and would do well to learn from some of these longer lasting nations. Of course, back then I had a more optimistic view of things, but not to say I've lost all optimism. However, in being reacquainted with the powers that be and the great engine of it all, I realized that the potential and the goals aren't aligned. I'll just put it like that. So yeah, let me dive into Black identity some more. It's interesting because I for one, I said, there's this whole talk between the diasporic peoples saying that African Americans, some people, now the ones that I roll with, like my African Caribbean friends, like we're here, most of us, or the people who have been in the country and around African Americans long enough to learn our culture and what we actually are like versus what the media pushes, or misrepresentations show. And when I say media pushes, I have been overseas and I've seen in a couple of countries just the limited view of how much of Black African American culture is put out there. And there's always these conversations and debates about it, but perhaps I can dig more into that in another video. Perhaps I should write that down so I don't lose my video ideas. But yeah, so you have first of all, okay, wait. This might have to be its own video. And because it is a multi-continental story involving tons and tons of different people and perspectives. So I may have to dive into that more now, later. But for now, the general overview to be brought in, I guess, on the Western Hemisphere side, African peoples brought to America. And as I told my class, nobody is a blank slate. No place is a blank slate. There was this notion that America was this great wilderness that Lewis and Clark walked through tons of empty space to explore. No, these were inhabited spaces that belong to people, and people live there for hundreds of years. They have their thoughts, their culture, their language, their beliefs, paradigms. If you speak another language, it's very nice to be able to step into the paradigm of that language. I had a stint with learning Arabic and learning that they don't have verbs, and just how something so simple changes how you view the world, right? It changes things. Or linguistically, how in English we focus on nouns, we make nouns the center of our speech, versus in the East, at least with texts, verbs being the center of speech, depending on which people group. This is, again, this world is very diverse. Excuse me. But where was I? I don't remember. I remember now. There we go. I had to wait for it. So we had African Americans being brought over. And I think it's interesting because I never heard this pointed out, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it is worth exploring. Like I said earlier, language is a barrier. And we know that the slave trade was practiced by the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, and the British, all of whom were, except for the Portuguese, were on the U.S. Territory, the area of the United States. So I wonder if there were enslaved African peoples on United States soil before the British people really made a note of it, with the French trappers and all that, you know? So it's a thought. But you got African peoples, mostly from West Africa, that have their beliefs, their culture, their languages, their paradigms, all of these things that go into people groups living together. And if you have never been in a place where you don't speak a language, it's rough. It's rough. There was a lot of stripping of culture because this is my theory. Well, no, this isn't a theory. This one, the goal was to make a product of the South, and the product wasn't cotton or it wasn't sugar. It was people, making property out of people. That was the major commodity of the South, right? On the other hand, my theory, I asked the question because I think it's important to distinguish peoples and perspectives again. I think a lot of times slavery is spoken of from a white perspective. And if you speak from a white perspective, you are looking out from that perspective. I don't think there's enough introspection into white culture and the development into that. And anytime somebody assumes himself to be the status quo or the I don't have a culture standpoint, then they are able to express and develop these patterns and habits without identification, without being checked, without awareness, no matter how harmful it may be or helpful. No culture is perfect. But these are just patterns that I notice. So I think, this is my theory, I think that the white slavers developed the way that they did because of the root of feudalism. This is my theory, where you have, at least in the English-speaking spaces, but in some other spaces, you have a king. This is back in like the 1500s. Yeah, you have a king who has the divine right to rule. God says that you're supposed to be in power. Now, did God really say that? No. Psalms 2. I have chosen my king. Who is that king? It's Jesus. Psalms 2. Okay? But at this time, there was a lot of twisting of scripture. I'd go as far as to say folks weren't really Christian, even if they did carry around a cross. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it could be a loon. Or some other waterfowl, you know? We got to see what it actually is. So, yeah. feudalism. You got the king, you've got the divine right to rule, you have different vassals, the lords, the ladies, the dukes, the duchesses, the earls, and the earlettes. I don't know what a female earl is, but they are all positioned a portion of land. Now, the king owned all the land, but he cut it up and gave it to people, right? They own the land, and it is their right to have the resources from that land. Then you have the serfs, the servant people. We've learned about this in medieval history, but the serfs are people who are tied to the land. They are servants. It's almost like a caste system. You're born it, you're gonna stay it until you die. You work the land. The materials from the land come to the person who owns the land, who then gives a tribute to the king. Even as I'm saying it, it sounds very parallel to the systems that we have today. But yeah, so I think that's where it started. Now, of course, there's the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, all these other things that happened in Europe. And I think that is where, somewhere along the way, we have the right to rule because of birthright. You all are born to be part of the land. People have twisted this 7 to 8 different ways. But now you have a people group, a mixture of different peoples in a new country, being forced to work, being indoctrinated, and stripped. And I think what is beautiful, wow, right? What's beautiful is that none of that stopped them from being human, because humanity isn't something you can take away. I am beginning to learn about learn from eyewitness reports about what happened, the importance of reading. But I think the most powerful thing I've realized is that when, again, you are coming from one perspective, and it may have shame, it may have guilt, we did these things to these people, how could we, these poor savages, quotes around that. It's almost the blue racism, where you're not calling us, but you're assuming us still less than yourselves. But it's pity instead of prejudice, which in and of itself is a form of prejudice when done like that. And so you have, again, the African peoples. They form together, they're blending together, it's almost Creolinizing, right? But one thing that I think is interesting, again, if you look at the original structure of America with the Native American people, this country was developed or designed in a way where people naturally became diverse, right? However that happened. But it's built to support or give way to the development of multiple different types of cultures, right? We see that with the natives, we see that with America today. The only place where we don't assume that to be true, and I won't say only, but another place where we don't assume that to be true is with African American people, Black people. We monolith them. Or even to the uninformed, like African people. Anytime we can put a plural, just like how I made the disclaimer earlier, how I'm saying I may not be as well read about native cultures and the differences between the hundreds of groups, but if I'm generalizing, excuse me, and educate me, please let me know, because I would love to learn, as you could tell. That same notion of like reducing people into the plurality has happened. It's just interesting. When we lack language for cultural distinctions, it can get messy, at least the way I see it. But I remember there was this time where I lived in Virginia, and I had to tell somebody, I was like, all black people aren't the same. Literally, somebody asked me a question. I said, I cannot speak for all black people. I cannot, because I recognize there's so many differences between the Deep South, the country, the coastal, the Northerners, the Westerners, the ways that African Americans scattered and developed either by force or by choice. It creates differences. And the beautiful thing about justice is that it takes those differences into account, you know? So I think there is this air of laziness and nihilism that hinge in the background of these conversations to say, well, if it's so different, then we can't possibly help and do and show up for all the different people groups. No, it's lazy. Your nihilism is not going to get better. What's the point? I despise that. Anywho. So you have, and let me get my bearings, we're in the 1700s currently. Not currently now, but where I'm at. Black people were enslaved, they fought in wars. Revolutionary War, did they fight in that one? I might have to go back and check. No, they fought in the Civil War for sure. There was these, when you are at court and you are getting a ruling, yes, that's what it is. There were rulings talking about the citizenship of African Americans. I mean, there's some really interesting things. There's early African American writers, poets. Crash Course has some pretty good resources for this history. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot going on back then. In the midst of even like being enslaved. I mean, people got free, some people didn't. It was a terrible institution, so much so that I may not be able to fully express on this camera, on this platform, how bad it was, but I think it's definitely getting sugar-coated nowadays. But I was walking to the grocery store, and I said, I wonder how many people can remember what it was like, you know? Like living today. Or at least close to, because what? Civil rights happened in the 60s. If you do the math of the people who are around and what age bracket they're in and when they grew up, that's a whole nother topic, like the bringing up of children in these spaces, what lingers into today. Context, people, context. That's a beautiful thing. Not that, but context is. Anyway, I gotta wash my hands. Yes, so, but yeah, African Americans never cease to be people. And like I tell my other diasporic folks, 400 years is enough time to develop a new culture. We've seen it, we've witnessed it, it has happened. But I don't know why African Americans seem to get the short end of the stick. But anyway, that's another video I might have to make. But boom, we have Reconstruction. So Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, I just learned this from teaching it, but when the South, the Confederate South now, when they lost the war, they weren't allowed to vote, which meant only Northerners and black people could vote. That's why we saw so much change during Reconstruction, right? If those who wanted to keep African Americans disenfranchised, as I'll say, could not vote, then there was nothing to stop the rise of African Americans to equality and justice. And that's where you see like some of the first black governors and things like, I mean, I thought that was incredible, because I was like, when I first learned about it, I was like, wait, wasn't it racist then? But at that time, they couldn't vote. And black people were able to begin looking towards Reconstruction. Unfortunately, for Reconstruction aimed to build the country back together and to give the formerly enslaved African Americans political, economic, and social stability. Yeah, the children of the Confederates got of age, and they started making things to box out, black people from being able to have a voice, economic, political, social, whether that be terror, whether that be tricks at the polls, or what are they called? Fees. Yeah, and that's where black codes kicked in, and later Jim Crow kicked in, to return African Americans to a sub citizen level. Now, stepping out of this perspective over here, we have this overarching view, and I discovered this later because, again, history is fun. But what happens socially, we talk about hierarchies, we talk about caste systems. America has a system. It's not just a socioeconomic one that we see with the classes, although class is very important. Like, literally learn about classism, please. It affects more than we all know or are aware of. But there was this gradient that was introduced with a proximity to whiteness being on the opposite end of being black. And there became such a disdain where we can see with other peoples, the Asian immigrants, the Latin immigrants, the just like all the other immigrants coming in, hearing the propaganda, the meta-narrative that to be close to white is to be closer to social, economic, and political stability. Why? Because black existence was destabilized in those areas thanks to people. But that's where and I was like, wow, I didn't know this, but that's where we see, even in the language of people today, how there is a discouragement from being close or similar to black people. There is an encouragement to be closer, similar to white people, to assimilate. And I remember asking two friends, one from Africa, one from Asia, or Asian culture, and I was like, yo, and I remember, like, them talking about the conversation about, hey, don't be like the black people when you go there. And I was like, what's up with that? And it wasn't until, I myself got into other spaces and other countries that I saw, again, the narrative of what black people are like in the US. Is it a true narrative? No. Why? Because it's not honest. It's not encompassing of the entire story. If you fragment it, if I only showed you one biome of the United States and said that's the whole picture, it's not the whole picture. Again, there's no perfect cultures. There's no, like the word says, all people have gone their own way, and God calls all nations to repent. Every nation has something to repent from, including whiteness, including blackness, including all the other nations. But I want to keep my video up. All of them. So yeah. Civil rights happened. And it's so funny. So if your grandparents are still here, they were born at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, flashing back over to Native peoples who have, again, been uprooted and shifted, and had genocide committed against them in their exiles from their native land. Because, again, we're not going to only say, hey, this is what it looks like from the outside, but stepping into their bubble as much as possible. You've lived here all your life, but this government with guns saying you have to leave. So now you're being exiled from literally your own roots, from where you were from, and forced into a foreign place, because you don't have to cross continent lines for somewhere to be foreign. I mean, if you ever see a southerner go to the north in the wintertime and they wear that thin jacket, okay, it's different than what they have become accustomed to. How much more for people who lived in a place for hundreds of years, maybe more, you know? It's very rough. And I remember learning how late Native Americans were to gaining rights in American politics. I know they have that thing with sovereignty going on, but I mean, even now it's still unjust. I know there's strides that's being made. I'm hearing about them, but I still am curious what restoration would look like for the Native peoples, because this country is so inhabited, you know. Now, I hope they're doing okay. I mean, I've been reading and seeing that it's rough on the reservations and things like that, but I've also been hearing that, like, they've been making some purchases and moves. And I remember when I was a teenager, learning about cultural erasure and seeing just the big push from Native peoples to make sure their culture endures. And I mean, that was one of my favorite developments that I saw over the last 10 years, just how well they have re-embraced their own culture, you know? And that's something to learn from, because I definitely see the same patterns of cultural erasure for African Americans. I mean, I think the most difficult thing is when you don't have barriers, it's easy for people to take and then displace. So, music, food, inventions, language, arts, all of that stuff stripped from original peoples, and then you're told that you don't have anything. The records are there for now, but I mean, unless we're learning them, then we may not be able to preserve them. And even just watching, I remember, I said, what happened in the last 30 years? Because I saw a substantial shift. Granted, my specific subculture in African American culture is Southern, however you want to delineate that. But it's interesting to see. Excuse me. It's interesting to see how much has shifted, at least where I'm at, you know, and how some things have stayed the same. I remember when I first started thinking about this, I was trying to prepare for the idea of being a father and having to pass on my heritage and teach about it. I said, yeah, it's important. It's important not just for it to be, oh yeah, black people, they were the slaves and now they're free, and then, you know, hip hop and rap. Love me some hip hop and rap, first of all. And yes, my people were enslaved, but that's not all they were. They were human beings before it, in it, and after it. And there's so many wonderful things that we have done, have developed. Rock, blues, jazz, opera. We didn't develop that, but we have opera singers, you know. But even more than that, because there's this little bit of a trap that the production or the performance of the people earns them their right to be on the stage with the rest of America. And that's not that's not fair either. To be human is to be enough, you know? So, anywho, then I would really like to examine white culture some more. I also know that there were issues, at least from what I've heard, read, seen on some of these documentaries with like other people groups as they came here. I learned about the concentration camps for the Japanese during the World War. And I remember hearing my Haitian friends, because when I was learning about Haitian culture, I had no idea they had protests in New York. You know, there's so much that isn't talked about. Then speaking of, I don't know, speaking of something, and then the taking over of Hawaii, I learned about that, how it was basically colonized. A company went in, got economic power, and pretty much shimmied around the queen, and they ended up having to concede their country. TED Talks got it for you, but I was like, wow, there's a lot going on. There is a lot going on. What did I just cover? 2015 to like what, 16, 14, 16? And this is, I mean, generalist, but I just felt like rapping about it. Oh my goodness. And just to leave this continent for a while, in South America, I didn't know that it was all one big like colony under Spain. And then hearing about Simon Bolivar, I was like, oh wow, like, dude is cool. I still need to look into that some more, because I, for one, have not studied like South America, you know. Central Caribbean, cool, a little bit. I've studied a bit, but South America, not so much. Yeah, just curious. And then I guess to be fair, because I do not like to talk on a America-centric history. I like to, like, you know, change perspectives. I'm trying to think, where should I go? Where should I go from here? I know stuff happening in Europe. Okay, yeah. And then in Africa, I've been learning about African history as a diasporic person from that continent. And I remembered a couple of things that I found to be interesting. First of all, speaking of the medieval period, how advanced Africa was. Like, the center of education was in North Africa. The university, and I did say university, that you want to send your kids to is in Africa, you know, leading the way in hygiene and math and all these things like that. And I'm curious with the conquest of North Africa. I wonder how that feeds into that. But I haven't gotten to that point. I'm still kind of in ancient African history right now. What else was going on? I remember hearing about when the Portuguese first began their slave trade. And I remember learning this a long time ago, but there were Christians in West Africa who opposed it. So, you know, that whole narrative, Africans sold Africans. Africans also spoke up against the injustice of slavery. We can't, again, shrink people down. It's diversity. Yeah, they protested it. It's not right to do. I think that was in Congo area. I'm thinking of doing like a Christian world history on my other page, just a little bit, because there is some more to the stories in there. I remember finding evidence of Christianity in West Africa pre-colonialization. It's like in the Arabic history. I remember reading, they were saying that like these areas and lands belong to Christians. That's interesting to find out. What else was happening during this time? I know there was colonialization happening in Africa, so you had King Leopold's genocide going on in Congo. A lot of people dying from that. Like, Leopold and Hitler and Stalin all of them need to be in the same category. The Holocaust and the Congolese genocide need to be in the same conversation. You know, if we're going to talk about the loss of a lot of human beings' lives, we should not favor one or over the other. We should favor justice, who considers all people. What else is there? Speaking of Christopher Columbus, you know, it's so funny how, like, it is so celebrated here in terms of the push for keeping Columbus Day and all that. When you read, what is his name? Francisco de Bar, I'm about to say Barbacoa. It's not that, but Barbolia or something like that. When he wrote about Christopher Columbus, that boy got arrested for abusing people and had his political position stripped from him. And then he was put in chains and brought back to Spain. Like, of course, he made bail, but he wasn't a good dude at all. There was a lot of horrible treatment of the native peoples in the Caribbean area. The initial enslavement, the genocide of disease and maltreatment, just terrible. Then what is going on? What else is going on? I want to learn more. Let's see. I wonder. Now, I might be getting something confused, but the Mongolian and Ottoman empires, when were they? I gotta look that up again. But, yeah. Anyway, the world's a big place. And again, sick day ramblings. I think the more that we understand history, since human beings are cyclical and time is cyclical and there's patterns, we can definitely learn not only why we are doing and being the way that we are, but why it keeps happening, what we could do to shift it, you know? What are those base core beliefs that people have? Thoughts like that. Let's see. Well, guess I'm done. So, this has been what it's been. Like, comment. Like, comment, share it, take some notes, maybe not. If you're curious about something, let's all learn together, you know? If you know something about something I've talked about or something I missed, let me know. Give me some resources. That'd be very nice. Yeah. Peace and blessings.